Well, so as I said, as Pam had said, my name is Casiana Warfield. I'm with Counseling and Psychological Services. And I just have so appreciated my ability to collaborate with ARC and others for this. So ideally, you all can see the screen right now in my presentation. Okay, great. So I feel like I learned so much from everybody else's testimonies, and I really appreciated everybody's vulnerability and also expertise. So I'll try to just do some background up and hopefully save some time for more questions at the end. Um, yeah, so I work with Counseling Psychological Services. Obviously, I'm going to slant my presentation towards mental health and why that can be a really important part of your professional journey. So I'll talk a little bit about resiliency in college, but probably going to focus the most on mental health issues that are specific to us, to Asian American students, professionals, and otherwise, right? So I'm pulling from the literature a bit on that, but also my own experience in working with students in therapy, individual group outreach, things like that. And then I'll briefly go over what mental health resources are available to you as students at Purdue. So I'm going to draw your attention first to the stress curve that I've got depicted here in illustration. So the main thing that I'm trying to get you to get from this is that there's an optimal level of stress for us where, you know, you need a little bit of fire under you to get you to do work, but not so much to where you're burnt out. And I think both Renz and Dr. Abraham spoke to this really well. Right. So when it gets excessive, you just get overwhelmed. You don't have the resources to deal with things anymore. And that's full stop. And it impacts performance, but it also impacts, most importantly, how you feel about yourself and your mental health, which affects everything. So, not to belabor the point of burnout too much, but really what that looks like psychologically is this physical and mental collapse, right? Often it looks like you're retreating into yourself. You're not prioritizing different parts of your life that were so important and meaningful to you to before. You're sort of just not, you're losing identity in a lot of ways. And often we think, well, I can do this and I can be this stressed out just while I'm in school. And then once I have my dream job, I can relax and I'll be okay. But usually what happens is those habits that you develop that led to your burnout in school continue into your career. And so we see these things, for instance, when students go on into medical school and they really tax themselves in that way, and then they're physicians and they're still burnt out, right? So these have long-term consequences, and it affects not just our work, but also our relationships and our relationship to ourselves. And so significant mental health issues will go untreated if we don't start to pay attention to this now. And so you can do things preventative for that. Some people, I think Dr. Abraham and Renz, I think Benny also talked about self-care. And I think what their testimonies really speak to is that it can look in a lot of different ways, whether it's sort of belongingness, as Denny was speaking about, whether it's physical well-being, as Renz was speaking about with diet and exercise, or, you know, whether it's spirituality and other interests, right, as Dr. Abraham was talking about. So I've got this graphic here to just really illustrate, you know, self-care is a multifaceted health behavior. It promotes mental health, but it also promotes physical health, short-term and long-term. And it needs to be tailored to you as a person, as a unique person coming into Purdue. So that means one self-care plan, even if it's comprehensive for one person, is not going to fit the next person, right? So paying attention to that. Of course, social support matters, but I think Denny did such a good job of covering that. I'm going to go forward. So what does it look like with our community? I feel like there are a lot of really specific issues that I've noticed in my work with Asian and Asian American students. But also the literature seems to support that as well. So one aspect of that I'm going to highlight is the idea of immigrant mentality. And so often we hear this in terms of, you know, the entrepreneurial spirit and, you know, sort of being proactive and, you know, being really effective and a go-getter. And that is such an American thing. And it's great. And I want to highlight there are strengths to that, right? Innovation, it probably got you to where you are now. Work ethic, and respect for where you come from and your heritage. At the same time, there sometimes are some negative consequences of this thing that we call immigrant mentality. So when we're prioritizing productivity and the group and preparedness, gratitude for opportunity, even when the opportunity is stressful, we prioritize those things perhaps above, our own sort of individual well-being, our wants, and things outside of the professional and work life. We can have some negative mental health consequences. So sometimes this looks like social comparison. If you grew up like me, daughter of an immigrant, then you may have been compared to your cousins, your siblings, your peers a lot, right? And the idea is that this is a self-improvement. It doesn't always feel that way, though. Sometimes it feels like embarrassment, shame, and guilt. You might be neglecting your individual needs for the purpose of productivity in your work, and that looks like self-sacrifice. You might have a lot of emotional restraint, which can look like strength from the outside, but often what it does is tell us that our emotions are shameful and shouldn't be in those spaces. And the idea that our emotions being out there are burdensome for other folks. It sometimes also looks like being really vigilant of potential setbacks and losses in the future, right? And that can be problematic. I know for myself and for my students especially, there's often this sort of comparative suffering process happening, meaning you look at your own struggles as a privileged student in higher ed, and you think, well, this isn't that bad. Why am I complaining? There's a lot of judgment happening because my parents or my grandparents or my great-grandparents suffered so much to be here, to get here, and to be successful so that I can do this. So I should be grateful. And that may be true. At the same time, it's not helpful for validating yourself and feeling like you have your own sense of identity and personal worth. And then there's also this added pressure of, because my family invested so much to be here and for me to have better opportunities than they had, I have a lot of pressure on me to succeed. So every quiz, every test, every class, every project has that much more weight and pressure to it. And so obviously these can add up and become those stressors that contribute to burnout, which can be problematic. Okay. Oops. There we go. And so there are some other stressors that we see that are specific to this population. So especially if you're an international student, and I think Denny spoke about this really well, the idea of culture shock and having to adjust to a new culture and a dominant culture. Even as an Asian American domestic student like myself, who've been here for a while, because often Asians are made to feel like perpetual foreigners. There is this idea that you're sort of the other on the outside, especially when you're in a predominantly white institution like Purdue. And so there's a lot of hidden social expectations, professional expectations that need to be just implicitly understood. And that takes a lot of adjustment and energy that can't go towards other things like work and relationships and self. There's also a lot of perfectionism in these students. That can be really harmful if it's rigidly adhered to, right? If you can't do things completely right, then it's not worth doing at all. That's sort of black and white thinking that can happen. Also, as Denny was speaking about, community and belonging is really important. And some of that is your racial and ethnic identity. And so that's another process that needs attention that sort of sets these students apart from maybe majority white students. And at the same time, what we tend to see for Asian and Asian American students is there's a lot of reticence to seek support, right? So I call this a type of double bind, meaning you both are sort of feeling like you can't seek help from your informal relationships, like your friends and your family. You have to deal with this all on your own and be independent. And at the same time, you might be avoiding those professional resources like counseling services, like medical doctors and things like that. And so I have this cycle depicted here because you can really see how it can be vicious in the way it develops. So if you have, cultural values that might be problematic for mental health, you might start defining your self-worth based off of the things that you achieve only. And engaging in negative achievement behavior, which if you haven't heard of that before, essentially what that can look like is perhaps you're, pursuing, success beyond the point that your mental health resources can maintain that. You might be cultivating your entire identity around what achievements that you can have professionally only. So any failures to that really breaks you down. You might be pursuing a specific career path simply because of the recognition that you might get from it, the prestige, rather than whether you are actually interested in it. It might be internalizing what your parents expect of you rather than necessarily what you want from your life. And so this can really break you down. It could even look like avoiding tasks that you feel like you might fail at because that failure would be very devastating. But then you don't grow. So this can really lead to failure and then burnout. And then at the same time, if you're feeling really hesitant to seek help, it just continues and ultimately is a losing game. And so speaking more about those barriers to help seeking, something that I would ask you all to consider as you're listening today, or if you're listening in this recording later, what messages do you get about self-care? What messages make self-care difficult or seemingly unattainable for you? And consider those, because those are internal barriers that you're experiencing. So here's some examples. This is from an account called Brown Girl Therapy I love, which is she's a South Asian therapist. She really speaks to these issues well. So she says, if you are praised only when you reach the next milestone, constantly compared to your peers, or reprimanded for slowing down, then it can be difficult to determine, or difficult to believe that your productivity doesn't determine your worthiness. And I think that really speaks to the immigrant mentality really well and how it can break down for us. And she also says, if you've ever been encouraged to make yourself small or praised when you put yourself last, or have been taught that self-sacrifice is a sign of respect, then it's an act of bravery to explore and voice your own needs. And I think this, again, really speaks to what you're up against if you're from some of these similar cultures and you really prioritize other things, other people, other tasks over your own well-being. And so to speak further about it, I loved Dr. Abraham's metaphor of like, put your mask on before other people's, right? So another way of saying that is you can't pour from an empty cup. You have to have resources to give in order to keep giving. And that means you need to refill your cup with things like self-care, community, mental health treatment, basic physical needs, things like that. But there's a lot of mental health stigma, meaning like there's a lot of perceived judgment around if you have mental health issues or if you ask for help in improving your mental health. And Asian American students especially have a really low tolerance for this stigma. And a lot of this has to do with the idea of saving face, which I'll talk about further. There are also institutional systemic barriers that you might be up against, right? So I am an Asian therapist, but there are not many. And there are especially not many in Indiana and not many at Purdue. And so that's important to acknowledge. We do have a provider, Penny Peng, who it can offer sessions in Mandarin. But if that's not your first language and you would really like to talk about vulnerable issues in that, there are a lack of language proficient providers in the area. And so that's a barrier. There are also cultural barriers that make mental health treatment, at least the way that we do it in the US, difficult for folks, right? So it might be that mental health is sort of lumped in with physical health, which is true. But the way that we provide services doesn't allow for that. It's not very holistic. We do provide mental health treatment, and then medical doctors provide the physical health. If you're more comfortable going to a spiritual leader or a medical doctor for everything, then this might not feel as comfortable or accessible to you. It also might be part of your cultural values to handle everything within yourself or within your family. And the idea of airing those things out to even a confidential professional feels problematic, right? So this idea of losing face or looking to be weak or shameful to others, and that denigrates your status in society. That's very difficult. Also, Asian Americans are less likely to be emotionally open and expressive about especially the more negative emotions. And And you might not feel super confident that therapy works for you, and that's fair. So there are a lot of barriers, but ideally the process would work this way. Now that you are here at this presentation, you are becoming more aware of cultural barriers that might be there in preventing you from taking care of your mental health. And ideally, what I would hope for you to take away would be you need to start to define your self-worth, not just based off of what you produce or what you achieve, but also about who you are, right? You have inherent worth just as a person. And there are things about you that are not tied to necessarily just what you're producing for the world or contributing to society, but just about who you are. And so hopefully that would lead to positive achievement behavior, which an alternative to negative achievement behavior looks like radical acceptance, meaning taking stock of, here are my limits. These are the limited resources I have. These are the limits of my environment, such as due to a pandemic or due to social unrest. And also celebrating your successes, right? And so accepting that you don't need to just look at areas of weakness to improve upon. You can also celebrate how you've done things well. This also means positive achievement is engaging in your values rather than your tangible outcomes, meaning you should be evaluating your behavior not based off of whether you got the thing or did the thing or achieved the thing, but also how values driven was it? Is this bringing me more meaning in my life? Am I feeling more satisfied with who I am and who I'm being? And then it, of course, involves self-compassion, which is just this understanding and kindness to yourself around failure, around success, and around who you are. And so I would like to highlight, happiness is not achieving or recognition from others, but it's actually pursuing meaning based on your values. At least that's what the literature would tell us. So ideally, this positive achievement behavior would lead to better quality of life. And hopefully that coupled with informal and formal help seeking would just serve to continue this more positive cycle for you. So this is just a quote from Brené Brown. So she is a great researcher on vulnerability and shame. And she talks about how true belonging is the spiritual practice of believing in and belonging to yourself so deeply that you can share your most authentic self with the world and find sacredness in both being a part of something and standing alone in the wilderness. True belonging doesn't require you to change who you are, it requires you to be who you are. And so that means you need to figure out what that means, who you are for yourself. And then another from Brown Girl Therapy, just a reminder that prioritizing your mental health does not mean you are rejecting your parents' culture or community. So you engaging in positive health behaviors might feel countercultural to where you're coming from and your heritage. It doesn't need to be a betrayal of what your parents and family have done for you, but just an alternative way of engaging with the world that might serve you a little bit better and feels more authentic to you. And that's okay. Your parents wanted you to have better opportunities than they did. So there's a point where self-care is not sufficient. And so that's when we come in as counseling services and also your other mental health resources. And so these are some signs that you really need to be reaching out for professional health. So if you're experiencing a persistent pattern of any of these behaviors or experiences, it's a really good sign, hey, reach out for help. And that's what we're here for. That's what we're paid for. And you have that right as students here. So if you're noticing you're not taking care of yourself well, your performance is being impaired in whatever way, you're withdrawing from the people you care about or the activities you care about, you have erratic or disruptive behavior that people are noticing. Perhaps like for myself as an Asian woman, I have a lot of somatic complaints when I'm stressed, right? Lots of muscle tension, headaches, things like that. Of course, if you're feeling very preoccupied around thoughts of killing yourself or somebody else, that's definitely a clear sign to contact someone immediately, or if you're relying upon substances to deal. So please reach out to us if you do need to. This is a great graphic that I might just link into the chat after, but certainly the slides will be available to you, that goes over all the mental health resources that you actually have on campus. And there might be more as we go into post-COVID semester as well. So the light gray boxes underneath the gold are all the services that CAP specifically provides. And so you can see that they range in terms of intensity. The idea with this graphic is the less intense your complaint, the less intense the treatment would be. And then you step it up from there until, you know, something as acute as, you know, suicidal thoughts and planning, that might be something more intense like hospitalization. But as you can see, we have a lot of different opportunities here. The dark gray are all things that are available on campus. And so ones that I'll highlight for students are one, you know, student support services at the Office of the Needy Students, right? There's also CARE, which I'll highlight, which is for those who experience sexual assault on campus. There are also resources in our community in terms of mental health. There's peer mentor wellness coaching and supportive peer support. And then, of course, the cultural centers are a great resource. So they provide services like this presentation, but I also provide just informal community and connectedness, which can be really great for dispelling shame and mental health stigma and things like that. So definitely encourage it. CAPS itself offers a lot of services, from educational workshops that you do as a group to group therapy where you can support each other with a mental health clinician present to sort of moderate that. And also brief individual treatment. So you would meet with a therapist like myself individually, as well as our emergency services where you can call at any time and be connected to a mental health professional if you're going through a crisis. So right now we have same-day assessments. So typically you can call in and make an appointment the same day or the next to be evaluated for which one of these supports is going to be best for you. And we also are doing all of these services remotely. So right now we're still here, we're still accessible. It's just that we're all going to be in our own homes doing these things video-wise to keep you physically safe. So I definitely welcome any questions that you have about that. I see the chat is sort of active, talking about my student hours that I'll be offering. And so I'll be here in the fall as well, and indefinitely. So those will continue going forward. So please drop in whenever you'd like to. Typically, they'll be Wednesdays at 1. Great. So I'll turn it back over to Pam. Thank you for your time.